But it is our responsibility and the responsibility of the president to use America's greatest power to shape history, not to lead from behind, leaving our destiny at the mercy of events. Unfortunately, that's exactly where we find ourselves in the Middle East under President Obama.
Well, that was Mitt Romney speaking at Virginia Military Institute today on the issue of foreign policy. One of his main points of focus was how the current administration seems to have grossly underestimated and misinterpreted the circumstances in the Middle East. Here to discuss this with me right now, former CIA operations officer and senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy, Clare Lopez. And joining us via Skype is retired Lieutenant General Jerry Boykin. Thank you both for being with us. Clare, let me start out by saying, I think everyone in America gives the president a big win for taking out bin Laden. Gutsy move, he said go. However, isn't it a fallacy to think, okay, bin Laden's gone, al-Qaeda is going to shrivel up and die?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Edie. What we're seeing right now is what was actually reported in a very important study done by the Library of Congress for the Pentagon, which came out in August of this year. And it's called Al-Qaeda in Libya, a Profile. And another report along the same lines comes from the Kronos organization, written by Mike Smith, and that one is called A View to Extremist Currents in Libya. What we're seeing is that al-Qaeda is actually in an expansion phase right now. It is expanding, but perhaps not always under its own name, but rather using, for instance, Ansar al-Sharia.
And I heard that name just a little bit here and a little bit there, but in connection distinctly with the attack in Benghazi.
Yeah, specifically there, you're absolutely right. Ansar al-Sharia is a name that has been used by a number of groups. They're obviously al-Qaeda affiliates or franchises, perhaps, you might want to say.
Many of the same people.
Many of the same people who have, and these groups have sprung up in different places over the last year or so, in Yemen, in Tunisia, and of course in Libya. And in Libya, there are a couple of different groups by that name. One is headquartered in Benghazi, and that is the group that is identified as having taken part in the attacks on our consulate in Benghazi, September the 11th.
Jerry, great to talk to you again. I was kind of surprised because the administration has continued to give us such varying explanations for what may, might, could have, should have, whatever, gone on at the consulate in Benghazi. And then for why they couldn't get in there to investigate. You understand operations of special forces, investigators, all of that. How did CNN and the Washington Post get in there in 4 days? And it took us 3 weeks? 3 weeks? While an ambassador's diary is sitting there, while documents about safe houses are sitting out there floating around because they've broken in there and ransacked? How does that happen?
Edie, you know, first of all, you have to ask yourself why there was not more security in there to begin with. You know, an embassy in Paris or London or Berlin has a Marine security guard there, yet a consulate or an embassy in a place that is still in the midst of a civil war has no Marine security guard on 9/11 after a series of threats and previous activities. So,
Jerry, I was told they wanted it and they were turned down.
Yeah, regardless of what the reason is, this is a major policy failure, a major decision by the State Department that has resulted in the death of 4 people and the embarrassment of our nation. So, you know, how does CNN and MSNBC and others get in there? I think that is probably pretty obvious. You know, there were some very bad decisions made by our government, by our administration, and we paid for it.
Can we outsource? Because I understand that's part of the issue also. Rather than having our people in there, we have a couple of ours, and then we have Libyan security forces or others. So I guess not to offend the host country or something along those lines. We trust them. Is that a good way to operate in countries in the Middle East?
Listen, you don't contract out the security of our diplomats. You know, needless to say, the Department of State for decades has had a security element. It's the Department of Security there at DOS. And their responsibility is to provide protection for our ambassadors in high-risk areas. Now, we didn't do that. We contracted it out, as I think I've heard it was a British firm. And remember, up until August, we actually had some of America's best. We had some special forces in there coming up on 9/11, and they sent them home and went with a straight contract. That's incredible. Somebody has to be held accountable for that.
Claire, should anybody serving in one of our consulates, embassies in the Middle East feel that they are secure right now? Have we demonstrated that we can keep them alive?
Well, certainly what happened in Benghazi doesn't give confidence. Now,
is it isolated? Am I overreacting to this?
No, not at all. It's not isolated. Let me give you a little bit of more expansion. First of all, just as General Boykin just said, we contracted out our security to the British at Benghazi. The British then subcontracted to a local Libyan militia group. That militia group's name is 17 February Martyrs Brigade. Now, in that brigade, one of the military commanders is a fellow by the name of Ismail al-Salabi. Ismail al-Salabi is a member of the Benghazi faction of Ansar al-Sharia.
Bringing us full circle, too.
And a member of the Libyan Muslim Brotherhood. Now, move over to a very important article written by Bill Gertz on the 5th of this month, October 2012, in which he talks about Egypt becoming the command and control center for al-Qaeda in the Middle East, the broader Middle East. Iran is behind it and helping them, and one of the leaders of that group there is Mohammed al-Zawahiri, the brother of the leader of al-Qaeda. Those people, headquartered, they say, Bill Gertz is saying, at Al-Azhar, the the premier seat of Islamic Sunni learning for 1,000 years, command and control center for al-Qaeda in the Middle East. Those jihadis that are coming there from all over the Middle East and the Muslim world are also going from Egypt outwards to places like Libya.
Jerry, let me ask you a broader question about the choices we have made, not just with this administration, but with many previous administrations. And that is that the devil we know is better than the devil we don't know. That has started changing now, where we decided that we were going to support, the Arab Spring. Well, this is a great step forward for democracy. Has it turned out that way?
Well, of course not. And Clare and I were two of the voices that said openly in the media that this is not a democracy movement when things started happening. And that's because we track what's going on. And we saw that Mohammed Badi, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, called for jihad in October of 2010. Jihad against America, as well as against the leaders of Islamic countries that have not implemented Sharia. And then the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood called for the same thing in January of 2011. And so when we saw these media outlets going up and finding the one Jeffersonian Democrat in a crowd of 1 million people and putting a microphone in their face, and they talked about wanting real freedom and real justice because they have been educated in the West, what they didn't show was that 1 million people behind them all wanted to bring about Sharia, Islamic law, and allow the Muslim Brotherhood to be the dominant influence. And that is what we have today. And even the liberal media has begun to accept and acknowledge that. Now they're trying to spin it.
Well, it is kind of amazing to see how many people who would really like to have us all dead were educated here in America, and educated so that they could then go back home and try to carry out those very plans. I mean, occasionally you wonder why you keep hitting yourself on the head. But Claire, what Jerry was just saying here, that you all were realizing, hey, this is who's behind it. Don't just look at the lovely face of this, which is great. People are finally saying, out with you, we want something different, but it's what? What different?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Jerry hit the nail on the head when he spoke about the timeline. I think you heard him say, that the supreme guide, Mohammed Badi of the Muslim Brotherhood, literally declared war on the United States in late fall of 2010.
If you know this, don't the people in Washington who are operating everything right now. Don't they know this?
Well, they certainly ought to have. There's no reason they shouldn't have. It was in the open media. It was publicized. And that followed, by the way, the first call to jihad against the United States, as Jerry said, Arab Muslim countries whose leadership was not implementing Sharia. And that call came from Al-Qaeda, specifically in its online English-language magazine called Inspire in July 2010. They called
I love that magazine, Inspire. And
They called for the Muslim world, and specifically those living in Arab countries where jihad was not implemented, to rise up. Then Mohammed Badi responds. The Muslim Brotherhood comes back and says, declares war on us. It took 9 months for the Department of State to respond to that declaration of war, and their response was in June 2011, to grant full diplomatic recognition to the Muslim Brotherhood. Al-Azhar chimed in January 2011 to finish the timeline with a fatwa declaring that offensive jihad was also legitimate, not just defensive jihad. So you had all three elements coming together.
We can't just say, you know, everybody over there is horrendous and, you know, close our eyes and hope it disappears. Clearly, we've got to figure out somebody to work with. But I certainly, after hearing what you have to say, Claire, and you, Jerry, I certainly hope that in Washington they're trying to figure out who we really should be working there to help our security situation. I appreciate your time. Clare Lopez and Lieutenant General Jerry Boykin.